How do you compare your group with the Beatles?
I don't know. How do you compare it with the Beatles? I don't compare it at all, there's no point.
Before the rivalry had a name, before it hardened into headlines, polls, and permanent sides, there was a country still breathing through rubble. Britain in the early 60s carried the weight of recent destruction like a low-pressure system. Cities rebuilt quickly but unevenly. Streets looked functional rather than hopeful. Color existed mostly in imported images, American films flickering in dark cinemas, record sleeves glimpsed through shop windows, voices carried across the Atlantic like contraband. Youth gathered not yet as a movement, but as a mass quietly realizing it was no longer satisfied with inheritance. Music did not arrive as rebellion at first. It arrived as permission. Permission to sound different from parents, to speak in accents that had been softened or erased in public life, to treat pleasure as something other than a brief escape. In Liverpool, a port city exposed to American rhythm through sailors and radio, songs felt like artifacts smuggled from another future. In London, a capital that understood power and performance, sound became something to be arranged, framed, and deployed. Two environments, two gravitational centers forming without yet touching. The Beatles emerged from a landscape of post-war austerity that demanded polish in exchange for access. Their early shape was defined by negotiation, between working-class origins and national visibility, between raw humor and public expectation. They learned quickly how to inhabit a stage as if it were a shared living room, how to turn charm into a bridge rather than a weapon. They did not yet represent innocence, but they learned how to perform approachability as a form of power. Their ascent felt swift, almost accidental, as if the country had been waiting for something to agree with. The Rolling Stones arrived as a counterweight still being assembled. They did not step into the same space. They circled it. Their sound leaned backward into older American blues, but their posture leaned forward into provocation. They looked less interested in being welcomed. Their energy suggested that the stage was not a living room, but an arena. Something contested, something to be occupied rather than shared. This was not yet a statement, only a tendency, a different relationship to exposure, a different use of friction. At first, there was no open line dividing them. They shared rooms, songs, sessions, and glances of recognition. Proximity did not create hostility. It created mirroring. Each group became aware of itself more sharply by noticing the other's reflection in the same spotlight. What the public would later interpret as opposition began as comparison. Comparison, once repeated, becomes measurement. Measurement, once amplified, becomes hierarchy. Media sensed this before audiences did. Newspapers and music weeklies learned that attention multiplied when narratives were simplified. Two forces read better than a field of many. A story needs edges. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones provided them. One polished enough to symbolize assent, the other rough enough to symbolize refusal. The contrast was not invented, but it was exaggerated, sharpened, and repeated until it felt inevitable. Behind the scenes, managers understood something older than pop music. Conflict organizes crowds. It provides orientation. You stand somewhere because something else stands opposite. What began as parallel trajectories was reframed as a shared arena. The same charts, the same cameras, the same questions asked in slightly different tones. Do you smile or stare? Do you bow or glare? Do you belong or do you threaten? This was not merely about sound. It was about how power could look in a new era. The Beatles suggested a future where mass appeal did not require menace. The Stones suggested a future where appeal depended on tension and risk. These were not moral positions. They were strategies. Each implied a different relationship to authority, desire, and control. Each carved a distinct path through the same cultural terrain. As television expanded, the spotlight grew harsher. Faces became symbols faster than voices. The screen flattened complexity and rewarded clarity. Viewers did not meet musicians as individuals, but as projections. The Beatles became a surface onto which reassurance could be cast. The Stones became a surface for unease, fascination, and fear. The audience did not choose simply between bands. It chose between ways of occupying visibility. The rivalry, still unnamed, functioned as an invisible architecture. It structured how youth imagined itself. Clean versus dangerous. Harmonious versus confrontational. Unity versus defiance. These were not stable categories, but they were useful ones. They allowed identification. They allowed distance from parents without demanding total rupture. One could rebel softly or loudly. One could choose a side without having to articulate why. In this early phase, the tension remained latent. There were no direct attacks, no declared hostilities, only the slow tightening of a symbolic field. Every success by one recalibrated expectations for the other. Every stylistic shift was read as response rather than exploration. Even friendship was reinterpreted through the lens of competition. Cooperation became evidence of strategy. Silence became evidence of disdain. The cultural arena had been set. Two centers of gravity now occupied the same space, bending attention around them. The stage was no longer neutral ground. It was territory, and territory invites claims. The rivalry did not begin with a clash. It began with alignment. Two forces rising at the same time in a system not built to hold them both without friction. What followed would not simply be a story of songs and scandals, but a prolonged negotiation over what popular power could mean, how it could look, and who it was allowed to belong to. The origins of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were shaped by geography before they were shaped by intention. Liverpool and London did not merely offer different scenes, they produced different orientations toward power. Liverpool was peripheral, exposed, porous. A city rebuilt under constraint, looking outward toward American culture as both escape and instruction. London was central, saturated with institutions, schools, hierarchies, and the inherited confidence of empire. These environments did not determine destiny, but they established default postures. One learned to adapt in order to be seen. The other learned to assert in order to dominate. The Beatles emerged from scarcity with an instinct for cohesion. Their early bond was forged less by ideology than by survival. Playing together was not a conceptual project, it was an economic and social necessity. This produced a collective identity that preceded individual ambition. Songwriting became dialogue. Performance became synchronization. Even humor functioned as glue. Their sound carried this imprint. Melodic, balanced, accessible, but never passive. Beneath the polish there was urgency, a pressure to hold together long enough to rise. This cohesion was refined through management that understood visibility as discipline. The transformation from leather jackets to tailored suits was not cosmetic alone. It was a translation. Working-class energy rendered legible to a middle-class audience. The Beatles learned to wear a persona that softened threat without erasing vitality. This was not submission, it was strategy. By occupying the center politely, they gained access to the entire structure. Their success depended on resonance rather than confrontation. They became mirrors in which the public could recognize itself without fear. Psychologically, this produced a particular dynamic. Individual egos were partially absorbed into a shared image. Desire was distributed. Recognition came as collective reward. This delayed fragmentation. It also deferred conflict inward. When tension emerged, it did so quietly, redirected into experimentation rather than rupture. The Beatles learned to sublimate ambition into form. Innovation appeared as evolution, not revolt. The Rolling Stones developed under opposite pressures. They were not bound by scarcity in the same way. Their backgrounds were more varied, their entry into music less clearly tied to escape. This allowed a different relationship to risk. They did not need to be embraced by everyone. They needed to be noticed. Their sound, rooted in blues, emphasized repetition, insistence, and physicality. It did not ask permission. It demanded attention. Management amplified this instinct deliberately. Where the Beatles were cleaned up to cross thresholds, the Stones were sharpened to test them. Refusal became posture. Not smiling became a statement. Disorder became currency. This was not rebellion in a political sense, but in a symbolic one. The Stones occupied the shadow cast by the Beatles' success and learned to weaponize it. They did not reject popularity, they redefined its terms. Psychologically, this produced a different economy of desire. Recognition was not shared evenly. It was contested within the group and projected outward. Performance became a site of dominance. The stage was less a place of harmony than of assertion. This fostered charisma that thrived on tension. Where the Beatles invited identification, the Stones provoked fascination. One offered a place inside the image. The other stood apart from it. The rivalry began to take shape not because the bands opposed each other personally, but because they occupied complementary symbolic positions. Each became the other's negative space. The Beatles represented coherence in a culture craving stability after disruption. The Stones represented fracture in a culture beginning to distrust stability itself. Neither position existed in isolation. Each gained clarity through contrast. Industry conditions accelerated this process. The British music scene was dense, competitive, and increasingly professionalized. Chart positions mattered not only as metrics but as narratives. Media outlets required recurring drama to sustain attention. Two dominant acts provided an ideal frame. Comparison became habitual. Questions were asked less to elicit answers than to reinforce polarity. Every interview echoed the same structure. How are you different? How are you better? How do you respond? This repetition transformed latent differences into perceived antagonism. Even moments of cooperation were reframed as strategic moves. When songs were shared, it was read as condescension or dependency. When styles overlapped, it was read as imitation or theft. The mimetic loop tightened. Each group became acutely aware of how it was being seen in relation to the other. Identity hardened through reflection. The psychological mechanism at work was not rivalry born of hatred, but rivalry born of proximity. Desire moved through the same channels. Success occupied the same charts. Validation arrived through the same screens. The rival was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a mirror that could not be escaped. To surpass the other was to surpass an image of oneself. This intensified the stakes beyond economics. The Beatles, increasingly conscious of their role as cultural center, responded by expanding inward. They sought complexity, depth, and experimentation. This was not retreat, but consolidation. By redefining what popular music could contain, they protected their position without direct confrontation. Innovation became a way to stay ahead without engaging the rival explicitly. The Stones responded by expanding outward. They leaned into provocation, sexuality, and scandal, not because these were essential to their music, but because they reasserted difference. Each outrage widened the gap. Each controversy reinforced their position at the edge of acceptability. This was not chaos for its own sake, but a calculated embrace of volatility as identity. Socially, audiences absorbed these cues and organized themselves accordingly. Identification with a band became a proxy for broader attitudes toward authority, decorum, and pleasure. Choosing the Beatles implied alignment with integration, with transformation from within. Choosing the Stones implied alignment with resistance, with pressure applied from without. These were not fixed ideologies, but they offered structure to adolescent self-definition. The rivalry thus crystallized as a cultural grammar. It translated abstract tensions into concrete symbols. Clean versus dirty. Harmony versus grit. Center versus margin. These oppositions were never absolute, but they were effective. They allowed millions to navigate a rapidly changing social landscape using music as orientation. At this stage, the conflict was still largely symbolic. There were no decisive breaks, no singular events that forced confrontation. Instead, there was accumulation. Each release, each appearance, each headline added weight to an emerging narrative. The arena was filling. The pressure was increasing. And with pressure comes movement. What began as parallel ascents was becoming a shared trajectory defined by comparison. The rivalry was no longer a lens applied after the fact. It was becoming a force that shaped decisions in real time. The stage was set not just for competition, but for escalation. The first phase of escalation did not arrive as open hostility. It arrived as acceleration. Success multiplied visibility, and visibility reduced room for ambiguity. By 1963 and 1964, the Beatles were no longer simply popular. They were infrastructural. Television appearances turned performances into national rituals. Chart dominance became a pattern rather than an achievement. Their presence reorganized expectations. What a band could be, how fast it could move, how far it could reach, all recalibrated around them. This expansion created a vacuum of meaning around the idea of opposition. If one group represented the center, then something else had to occupy the edge. The Rolling Stones did not initially claim this role. It was offered to them. Media language began to frame them as the alternative almost by default. Not because they demanded it, but because their posture allowed it. Their refusal to smooth out roughness made them legible as contrast. The arena required tension. They supplied it. Management understood the opportunity immediately. Where the Beatles' ascent had been engineered through respectability, the Stones' rise would be engineered through disturbance. Scandal became a form of signal amplification. Each incident, minor in isolation, gained symbolic weight through repetition. Reports of unruly crowds, defiant interviews, and confrontations with authority were not merely documented. They were curated. Disorder was framed as authenticity. Threat became spectacle. This strategy repositioned the Stones from peripheral act to symbolic challenger. Not by matching the Beatles' reach, but by reframing the terms of engagement. They did not compete on harmony or breadth. They competed on intensity. The message was implicit but consistent. Where the Beatles offered cohesion, the Stones offered rupture. Where one smoothed edges, the other sharpened them. The rivalry moved from latent contrast to active differentiation. Psychologically, this marked a shift in how both groups related to their public images. The Beatles, increasingly aware of their role as cultural anchors, experienced their own persona as both asset and constraint. The expectation of accessibility began to feel like enclosure. Their smiles, once spontaneous, became obligations. Their unity, once organic, became performative. Pressure accumulated not from the Stones directly, but from the impossibility of remaining static while occupying the center. The Stones, by contrast, found freedom in instability. Their image did not require preservation, only escalation. Each provocation raised the bar for the next. This produced a cycle where risk fed recognition. Desire circulated through outrage as much as admiration. The Stones learned to operate in the shadow of disapproval without being diminished by it. In some cases, disapproval was the point. The rivalry intensified through proximity rather than distance. Both bands moved through the same circuits. Studios, clubs, press offices, and social scenes overlapped. This closeness sharpened awareness. Each knew exactly what the other was doing, releasing, and becoming. Silence was no longer neutral. Every move was interpreted as response or preemption. Even stylistic experimentation risked being read as imitation or defiance. One emblematic moment of this phase came through songwriting itself. The exchange of material, initially an act of generosity, began to carry asymmetrical meanings. When Lennon and McCartney offered songs, it could be read as patronage. When the Stones reinterpreted them with greater grit, it could be read as appropriation. The same gesture held different symbolic values depending on perspective. This ambiguity fueled resentment without requiring confrontation. Media coverage tightened the mimetic loop. Headlines increasingly framed releases as contests. Who was ahead? Who had surpassed whom? The charts became scoreboards. Sales figures were treated as proof of moral or aesthetic superiority. The audience was invited to choose not just what it liked, but what it stood for. Identification hardened. Taste became allegiance. At this stage, the rivalry still operated within a shared structure. Both bands benefited from the same machinery. Both relied on amplification provided by television, print, and radio. Yet their relationship to this machinery differed. The Beatles used it to stabilize and extend influence. The Stones used it to destabilize and provoke reaction. One moved through the system as if it were a foundation. The other treated it as a wall to be marked and tested. The escalation was not symmetrical, but it was reciprocal. Each band's success intensified the other's necessity to define itself more clearly. The Beatles could not remain merely charming. The Stones could not remain merely rough. Differentiation required exaggeration. Subtlety was lost as contrast sharpened. The rivalry began to function less as comparison and more as structure, a binary that simplified complexity into orientation. Culturally, this coincided with broader shifts. Youth identity was fragmenting. The early optimism of the decade gave way to suspicion toward authority and inherited narratives. Music absorbed this tension. The Beatles, sensing the limits of their early image, began to turn inward, experimenting with sound and form. The Stones turned outward, aligning themselves more openly with disruption and dissent. These were not reactions to each other alone, but they were filtered through rivalry. By the mid-60s, the arena was no longer neutral ground. It was charged with expectation. Each new release carried symbolic weight beyond its musical content. Songs were heard not only as expressions, but as moves. The rivalry had entered a phase where escalation was no longer optional. It was structural, and structure, once established, demands continuation. The first act of open comparison had ended. What followed would be louder, heavier, and less easily contained within image management. The pressure was building toward collision. The second phase of escalation unfolded as the rivalry crossed a threshold from image to substance. What had been managed contrast began to seep into artistic direction, public posture, and the emotional temperature of the era itself. By 1965, both bands were no longer reacting only to each other, but to the consequences of their own expansion. Scale altered everything. The arena grew too large to remain symbolic. The pressure demanded transformation. For the Rolling Stones, this phase crystallized around a single axis: assertion. The release of music that leaned aggressively into desire, dissatisfaction, and refusal marked a decisive shift. The Stones no longer needed to be framed as an alternative. They declared themselves as a force. Their sound thickened. Rhythms became heavier. Lyrics abandoned ambiguity in favor of confrontation. Satisfaction was not just a hit. It was a statement of presence, a claim staked at the center of youth frustration. Psychologically, this moment signaled a consolidation of identity. The Stones embraced a posture that did not seek reconciliation with authority. They positioned themselves as an outlet for unarticulated tension. Desire was no longer romanticized. It was restless, unfulfilled, insistent. This aligned them with a generation beginning to distrust promises of harmony. The Stones did not offer solutions. They offered recognition of pressure. The Beatles, witnessing this shift, did not respond by matching aggression. They responded by expanding complexity. Their music turned inward and outward simultaneously. Experimentation accelerated. Song structures loosened. Lyrics grew layered, elliptical, and introspective without becoming private. This was not retreat. It was redefinition. The Beatles began to occupy a different dimension of the arena. Less immediate, more expansive. This divergence intensified the rivalry by removing shared ground. Comparison became more abstract. The question was no longer who sold more or who shocked more. It was who represented the future. The Stones embodied immediacy, rawness, and confrontation. The Beatles embodied possibility, exploration, and synthesis. Each trajectory implied a different resolution to the cultural tension of the decade. Media struggled to contain this complexity. Simplification returned. The Beatles were framed as evolving artists. The Stones as dangerous provocateurs. These narratives hardened despite evidence to the contrary. The Stones were thoughtful, strategic, and disciplined. The Beatles were increasingly volatile, fragmented, and internally strained. But perception mattered more than accuracy. The rivalry operated at the level of myth. As political unrest intensified globally, the Stones' alignment with confrontation gained symbolic weight. Their presence at demonstrations, their flirtation with scandal, and their refusal to present themselves as moral guides positioned them closer to the emerging language of dissent. The stage became a site of transgression. Concerts blurred into confrontations. Audience energy spilled beyond containment. The arena tested its own limits. The Beatles, constrained by their earlier positioning, found political expression more difficult. Their reach was broader, but their movement was slower. When they spoke, the echo was larger and less controllable. Silence became a strategy. Withdrawal from touring was not only exhaustion, it was recalibration. The Beatles retreated from the arena physically, but expanded it conceptually through studio experimentation. They transformed the recording space into a new territory of power. This divergence intensified symbolic opposition. The Stones remained visible, embodied, and confrontational. The Beatles became abstract, mediated, and interior. One group pressed against the walls of the arena. The other built new chambers within it. Neither approach negated the other. Together, they mapped the full range of cultural response to acceleration. The rivalry now operated on multiple levels simultaneously: musical, psychological, political, industrial. Each band functioned as a reference point for the other, even in absence. The Stones' provocations highlighted the Beatles' restraint. The Beatles' experimentation highlighted the Stones' immediacy, each identity sharpened by contrast. Behind the scenes, cooperation and proximity persisted. Shared sessions, mutual support during legal and media crises, and coordinated releases contradicted the public narrative. But this contradiction did not weaken the rivalry. It strengthened it. The gap between lived reality and mediated myth widened. The rivalry became less about personal antagonism and more about symbolic necessity. The public no longer needed the bands to be enemies. It needed them to represent oppositional forces. Harmony versus friction. Expansion versus pressure. Integration versus rupture. These forces structured how audiences interpreted not only music, but themselves. Choosing a band was choosing a posture toward change. As the decade advanced, the stakes grew heavier. Idealism collided with violence. Protest met repression. The arena darkened. Music absorbed grief as well as desire. The Stones leaned into darkness. The Beatles leaned into disassembly. Neither path offered comfort. Both reflected a culture losing innocence at different speeds. By the end of this phase, the rivalry had exceeded management, exceeded media, exceeded intention. It had become an autonomous structure, a myth in motion. The next escalation would not be driven by image or sound alone, but by consequence. The arena was approaching its breaking point. The third movement of the rivalry unfolded not through deliberate escalation, but through collapse. What had been framed as opposition now intersected with limits that neither band could fully control. The cultural arena expanded faster than the structures meant to contain it. Media amplification, audience size, and symbolic weight converged into a pressure system that transformed every gesture into consequence. The rivalry entered a phase where momentum itself became dangerous. For the Rolling Stones, this meant confronting the cost of living permanently at the edge. Provocation, once a tool for differentiation, became a liability when scaled beyond intimacy. Concerts grew larger, less personal, and more volatile. The arena no longer behaved like a space of shared release. It behaved like a site of confrontation. Disorder, once symbolic, turned physical. Control slipped not because it was abandoned, but because it could no longer be maintained. This culminated in moments where the boundary between performance and reality dissolved. Violence entered the frame not as metaphor, but as fact. The stage, once a platform, became a fault line. The Stones did not cause this rupture, but their alignment with tension made them inseparable from it in the public imagination. The shadow they had inhabited now stretched beyond their reach. The myth of danger ceased to be theatrical. It became historical. Psychologically, this marked a turning point. The Stones were forced to reckon with the difference between embodying resistance and being consumed by it. The posture that had fueled their ascent now demanded recalibration. Survival required structure. The wildness that had defined their appeal had to be integrated or risk self-destruction. The arena demanded not only presence, but endurance. For the Beatles, the collapse manifested differently. Their withdrawal from touring insulated them from immediate volatility, but exposed internal fractures. The absence of a shared external focus intensified inward pressure. Individual identities, long deferred in service of cohesion, asserted themselves. Creative freedom expanded, but so did conflict. The studio became both sanctuary and battleground. Exploration turned into divergence. The rivalry, once externalized, now echoed within the group itself. Comparison no longer required an outside mirror. Each member became a reference point for the others. The unity that had functioned as strength became constraint. The Beatles' response to the collapsing arena was fragmentation. Not chaotic, but inevitable. The The structure that had allowed them to occupy the center could not accommodate unlimited expansion inward. Media narratives adapted quickly. Where once the rivalry had been framed as a duel, it was now framed as a verdict. The Stones were portrayed as having survived the storm by embracing hardness. The Beatles were portrayed as having dissolved under their own complexity. These readings flattened reality, but they provided closure for an audience seeking orientation amid chaos. The myth demanded resolution even when history did not. Culturally, this phase coincided with the erosion of the decade's early idealism. Political assassinations, war, and social unrest reshaped expectations. Music could no longer function solely as release. It became documentation. The Stones' continued presence on stage aligned them with persistence through disorder. The Beatles' retreat into private creation aligned them with introspection and disillusionment. Both responses reflected legitimate paths through loss of innocence. The rivalry now operated less as competition and more as contrast in outcomes. One band adapted by consolidating power externally, building an empire that could withstand turbulence. The other adapted by dissolving the collective form, allowing individual trajectories to emerge. Neither outcome invalidated the other. Together, they illustrated the limits of the structures that had produced them. What is striking in this phase is the absence of triumph. There is no clear winner, only survival in different forms. The Stones continued, but at the cost of proximity to catastrophe. The Beatles ended, but preserved a body of work sealed in time. The rivalry did not resolve through dominance. It resolved through divergence. The arena did not crown a victor. It fractured. Symbolically, this marked the transformation of rivalry into legacy. What had been a living tension became a fixed reference. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones ceased to function primarily as contemporary forces and began to function as historical poles. Their opposition no longer generated new movement. It generated interpretation. The myth stabilized. The third movement ends not with reconciliation or defeat, but with crystallization. The rivalry had completed its arc from latent contrast to destructive pressure to symbolic permanence. What remained was not conflict, but structure, a map through which subsequent generations would navigate their own tensions between harmony and friction, integration and resistance, center and edge. The arena stood emptied of immediate combat, but marked by its traces. The rivalry no longer needed participants. It had become an inherited framework, waiting to be activated by those who came after. Once the rivalry passed out of lived time and into collective memory, its function changed. It no longer operated as a contest between two active forces, but as a symbolic system through which culture could read itself. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones became more than bands. They became coordinates, points between which meaning could be triangulated. Their opposition hardened into a grammar that shaped how popular music, identity, and power were interpreted long after the original conditions had vanished. At the cultural level, the rivalry offered a way to simplify complexity without erasing it entirely. Modernity accelerates differentiation faster than individuals can process. The Beatles and the Stones provided a binary that absorbed this excess. One could locate oneself quickly, order or disorder, synthesis or confrontation, safety or risk. These choices were never purely musical. They were psychological shortcuts, ways of orienting the self inside a rapidly shifting social landscape. This binary produced tribal alignment. Fans did not merely listen. They identified. Preference became declaration. To align with the Beatles was to affirm a belief in coherence, progress, and the possibility of transformation without rupture. To align with the Stones was to affirm a belief in intensity, defiance, and the necessity of friction. These positions mapped cleanly onto broader generational tensions. How much of the old world could be reworked? How much needed to be burned? Media ecosystems amplified this dynamic relentlessly. Television, print, and later retrospective documentaries did not just report the rivalry. They stabilized it. Each retelling refined the myth. Contradictions were smoothed. Nuance was sacrificed in favor of recognizability. The rivalry became portable. It could be invoked in new contexts to explain new conflicts. Clean versus dirty. Pop versus rock. Art versus danger. The original reference faded, but the structure remained. In this way, the rivalry functioned as a template. Subsequent musical conflicts were framed through it, whether consciously or not. Punk versus prog. Disco versus rock. Grunge versus glam. Each new opposition echoed the same logic. Two poles. One claiming authenticity through refinement. The other claiming authenticity through abrasion. The Beatles and the Stones became ancestral figures in a lineage of cultural friction. Psychologically, this endurance speaks to a deeper mechanism. Rivalry externalizes internal tension. It allows societies to stage conflicts that cannot be resolved privately. The Beatles embodied the promise that desire could be harmonized. The Stones embodied the counterclaim that desire is irreducibly excessive. Neither position can fully absorb the human condition. Their coexistence allowed the culture to oscillate rather than choose definitively. This oscillation shaped artistic production itself. Musicians learned to position their work in relation to these poles, even when the reference was implicit. To sound polished risked accusations of emptiness. To sound raw risked accusations of chaos. Innovation emerged in the negotiation between these dangers. The rivalry thus acted as a generative constraint. It narrowed the field in order to intensify creativity within it. The symbolic meanings attached to each band also evolved with time. The Beatles' image shifted from contemporary phenomenon to lost unity. They came to represent a moment before fragmentation, a closed system of collaboration that could not be replicated under later conditions. The Stones came to represent persistence without closure, a refusal to end, to resolve, to be contained by nostalgia. One became an artifact, the other a process. Socially, this distinction mattered. The Beatles allowed listeners to imagine an origin. The Stones allowed them to imagine continuity. In periods of uncertainty, both functions were necessary. One offered memory as anchor. The other offered endurance as model. The rivalry thus continued to serve psychological needs long after its original stakes had dissolved. The language of the rivalry also shaped how masculinity was performed in popular culture. The Beatles' early presentation normalized vulnerability within collectivity. Sensitivity framed as charm. Cooperation framed as strength. The Stones normalized dominance, sexuality, and confrontation as forms of presence. Neither model was complete. Together, they expanded the range of acceptable expression. They carved space for complexity through opposition. Importantly, the rivalry also revealed the role of institutions in producing meaning. Without managers, labels, journalists, and broadcast systems, the opposition would have remained fluid. It was the repetition of contrast through media channels that hardened perception into belief. This demonstrates how culture does not merely reflect conflict. It organizes it. It gives it duration and shape. As decades passed, the rivalry detached from factual accuracy entirely. Evidence of friendship, collaboration, and mutual influence became footnotes. What mattered was the myth's utility. The story persisted because it worked. It provided coherence to a sprawling cultural history. It allowed the past to be narrated as structure rather than chaos. In this sense, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones function as archetypal figures rather than historical rivals. They are less important as individuals than as positions within a symbolic field. Their names evoke entire constellations of meaning instantly. Harmony and friction, completion and excess, memory and motion. These meanings continue to circulate because they correspond to enduring tensions within modern identity. The rivalry did not end when the music stopped being contemporaneous. It ended when it became unnecessary to ask who was ahead. At that point, it had succeeded. It had transformed from competition into infrastructure, a permanent frame through which culture could recognize its own contradictions without having to resolve them. What remained was not agreement, but legibility. The conflict had taught audiences how to read difference, how to inhabit it, and how to pass it on. In doing so, it ensured its own survival as myth. In the aftermath, the rivalry no longer functions as a question to be answered. It functions as a condition. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones exist now in a space where comparison is automatic and resolution is irrelevant. Time did not dissolve the tension. It stabilized it. What once felt like movement hardened into orientation. The rivalry became a fixed horizon against which popular culture continues to measure itself. The Beatles' legacy settled into stillness. Their ending sealed their image. Because they stopped, they remain complete. Their work forms a closed architecture, finite, internally coherent, endlessly interpretable. Each return to it feels archaeological rather than contemporary. They represent a moment when collective creation seemed capable of outrunning fragmentation. That belief persists not because it was fully true, but because it was briefly convincing. The Beatles endure as a symbol of synthesis that could not survive its own success. The Rolling Stones moved in the opposite direction. Their legacy is inseparable from continuation. They refused closure. By persisting, they transformed endurance itself into meaning. Their presence across decades collapses historical distance. They do not belong to a single era. They stretch across eras, carrying residue from each. This continuity comes at a cost. Myth must constantly renegotiate relevance. But it also grants a different kind of authority. The Stones represent survival through adaptation rather than preservation. This divergence crystallized the rivalry into two incompatible models of cultural power. One model achieves permanence by ending at the right moment. The other achieves permanence by never ending at all. Neither can invalidate the other. Each exposes the limits of its opposite. Completion risks fossilization. Continuation risks dilution. The rivalry survives because it stages this dilemma without resolving it. Importantly, the rivalry's persistence has little to do with personal antagonism. As the decades passed, direct conflict softened into commentary, irony, and occasional provocation. These gestures no longer escalate anything. They function as maintenance of myth. Small sparks to remind the audience that the structure still exists, that the old coordinates remain usable. Culturally, this myth continues to operate because it aligns with how modern societies understand themselves. The tension between integration and resistance has not disappeared. It has multiplied. Institutions still promise coherence. Counterforces still insist on disruption. The Beatles and the Stones remain useful shorthand for these dynamics. They compress complex histories into instantly legible symbols. In this sense, the rivalry now belongs more to audiences than to artists. It is activated whenever people argue about authenticity, risk, or meaning in popular culture. It resurfaces in debates about whether art should soothe or unsettle, whether it should refine existing structures or expose their fractures. The original music becomes secondary. The framework remains primary. There is no reconciliation to be offered because reconciliation would dissolve the structure. The rivalry does not seek peace. It seeks balance, a balance maintained through opposition rather than agreement. Its endurance suggests that culture requires antagonistic poles in order to remain intelligible. Without contrast, power becomes opaque. Without friction, movement loses direction. The final state of the rivalry is not silence, but background radiation. It hums beneath discussions of music, identity, and history. It does not demand attention, but it shapes perception when invoked. It is no longer lived, but it is continuously rehearsed. Each new generation inherits it not as a conflict to resolve, but as a lens to see through. What remains, then, is not a verdict on who mattered more, but an understanding of why both were necessary. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones functioned as opposing answers to the same historical pressure. Their rivalry gave form to that pressure. Once formed, it could be remembered, reused, and reimagined. The legacy is not harmony achieved or rebellion victorious. It is structure preserved, a cultural architecture built from tension that continues to hold meaning precisely because it never collapsed into resolution. The rivalry endures not as an argument, but as a map.